Hello, my name is Cecilia Sun and I teach musicology and piano here at the Conservatorium of Music at UWA. In this video, I'll give you an overview of Louis Armstrong's West End Blues, one of your ATAR set works. I'll tell you about the beginnings of jazz and where this important recording sits historically. And I'll talk about the structure of this tune and point out some of the features that have made West End Blues one of the most important recordings in jazz history. We know very little about the origins of jazz. Initially, the lines were blurred between jazz, blues, and ragtime, all forms of African American music at the turn of the last century. As these were all transmitted through oral traditions, we have few written documents and even fewer recordings. Much of what we know about the origins of jazz comes from interviews of aging jazz performers decades after the music was first established. Here is what we do know. The city of New Orleans played an important role, with African American musicians taking the lead. We know that jazz was a mix of a large number of musical styles and traditions, including African elements in terms of timbral manipulations and rhythm and melodic approaches. It also included bits of the blues and ragtime and band music, such as that of John Philip Sousa. Other European, Latin American, and American music influences also played some part. We know that early jazz was played to accompany dancing, often at places that served alcohol, such as restaurants, nightclubs, cabarets, and dance halls. And we also know that the earliest forms of jazz were improvised. The first jazz recording dates from 1917, but the citizens of New Orleans had been playing what became known as jazz since around 1900. Of course, they didn't call it jazz. They thought they were playing some kind of idiosyncratic local band of ragtime. The earliest mentions of jazz in a San Francisco newspaper had nothing to do with music at all. It was used to describe a baseball game to denote play with pep and enthusiasm. Quote, "Everybody on the team had come back full of the old jazz," end quote. Early newspaper accounts and individual bands spelt jazz in any number of ways, including J-A-S, J-A-S-S, J-A-Z, J-A-S-Z, and my personal favorite, J-A-S-C-Z, as well as our now familiar form of spelling jazz, J-A-Z-Z. It wasn't until the 1920s, when many of the early generation of jazz musicians moved north to cities like Chicago, that we began to gather a significant amount of documentation about jazz, both in terms of recordings and also in texts like writing about and interview with musicians. By then, this kind of music had gained such popularities that they called the 1920s the Jazz Age. This is a picture from 1923 of King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band with a number of figures important to our discussion here. King Oliver, who wrote West End Blues, was a cornet player and band leader from New Orleans. You can see him in the back. His second cornet player, Louis Armstrong, here kneeling in the front playing the trombone, and at the piano, Lil Hardin, a rare female jazz instrumentalist from this time. Hardin was a conservatory-trained musician, and from 1924 until they split in the 1930s and until their eventual divorce in 1938, Hardin was Louis Armstrong's wife and musical collaborator. Early on, jazz was a group enterprise, with musicians in the band sharing solo duties. Listen, for example, to King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band's Dipper Mouth Blues, recorded in 1923. I've given you a link to this recording. Dipper Mouth Blues has a brief introduction, followed by 9 choruses, that is 9 repetitions of the 12-bar blues. Of these 9 choruses, 4 were played by the full ensemble improvising together, a key characteristic of the New Orleans style. 2 were clarinet solos by Johnny Dodds, and 3 choruses featured King Oliver as soloist on the cornet. It was the emergence of superstar soloists like Louis Armstrong that threatened the group improvisation style of New Orleans jazz. Günter Schuller, in his book Early Jazz, accurately names his chapter on Armstrong the first great soloist. Louis Armstrong was born into poverty in New Orleans in 1901. His father deserted the family, and his mother did whatever she had to do to support her children. Armstrong started working at the age of 7, doing things like singing in a vocal quartet at street corners for money. At the age of 12, he was declared delinquent for firing a pistol in the air to celebrate the new year and was sent to what was called the Colored Waifs' Home, a local reform school. Conditions were harsh there, but Armstrong, who already played the trumpet, received formal music lessons and played in a band. He left 2 years later as an accomplished musician. After King Oliver left New Orleans for Chicago, Armstrong joined him there as his second cornet player. That's the picture that you saw earlier in this video. He then spent a few years in New York as one of the all-stars in Fletcher Henderson's orchestra. By 1925, he was back in Chicago. For the next 3 years, Armstrong, now anointed as a leader, accompanied by his Hot 5 and Hot 7 groups, produced 65 recordings that thrilled the jazz world and beyond with their magnetic musicianship. Trumpeter and band leader Max Kaminsky commented that he felt, quote, as if I had stared into the sun's eye, end quote, after hearing them. Armstrong, the trumpet player, became known for his electrifying tone, magnificence of ideas, harmonic sense, superb technique, power and ease, hotness and intensity, and complete mastery over his instrument. It also turned out that he had a captivating voice. His gravelly, rhythmic warmth would emerge as one of the most memorable of the 20th century. And most crucially of all, for a jazz performer, Armstrong had swing. This recording of West End Blues comes from this period. The tune was composed by King Oliver about a popular picnic and entertainment area in New Orleans. Oliver recorded it just 2 weeks before Armstrong. There are a number of other notable recordings, including a vocal take with Ethel Waters, and how Armstrong himself would record this later in his career. But the most famous version of West End Blues, and the one that you've been assigned, is the one that Armstrong recorded on June 28, 1928, with the Hot 5, and we've given you a link to this. In this recording, we can hear the key influences of Armstrong at this time. First, the African-American oral tradition noted scholar Henry Louis Gates has called signifying, that is, embellishing upon and therefore adding new meaning to something that already exists, in this case, the 12-bar blues and King Oliver's tune. Second, Armstrong's experiences in cabarets, which taught him how to be the supreme entertainer. And finally, the virtuosity he was inspired to learn from his then-wife, pianist Lil Hardin, who drilled him in technical exercises. Armstrong recorded West End Blues with a typical New Orleans front line of trumpet, clarinet, Jimmy Strong, trombone, Fred Robinson, and a rhythm section of piano, Earl Hines, banjo, Mancy Carr, and drummer Zutty Singleton on hand cymbals. Yes, Armstrong and his Hot 5 group, a group that only existed in the studio, actually had a total of 6 players in this recording. West End Blues is based on the 12-bar blues, which is simply a series of chords over which musicians would improvise. You can see the basic form of the 12-bar blues here. The 12 bars divide into 3 phrases of 4 bars each, with the harmonies you can see on your screen. 4 bars on 1, followed by 2 bars on 4 and 2 bars on 1, and concluding with 2 bars on 5 and the final 2 on 1. All but the final iteration of this pattern can end on the dominant as a way of leading back into the next repetition of this chord progression. From this standard and very simple formula, there exist many possibilities for variations. West End blues essentially follows this pattern with a few changes in each chorus. The piano improvisation differs the most with a number of substitution chords, but it still keeps to the basic formula of the 12-bar blues. When you listen to it, it's very easy to follow. The tune is in 4/4 and there's a steadied crotchet accompaniment throughout. So if you just count up to 4 and keep track of the number of bars, you will always know where you are in the structure. The overall structure of 12-bar blues is also quite simple, as you can see. There is an introduction, and what an introduction it is. I'll get back to that in a bit. The introduction is followed by 5 iterations of the 12-bar blues, the last of which breaks into the coda. Armstrong takes the first solo, beginning with a straightforward statement of Oliver's tune to establish the identity before improvising decoratively. This is followed by trombone improvisation and a clarinet solo playing in its shallow range. The shallow range is the lower range of the clarinet. Note the call and response between Jimmy Strong on the clarinet and Armstrong's warm scat singing. This is another important and famous feature of this recording. The fourth chorus is just the piano, with Earl Hines improvising virtuoso florid lines in the right hand over his own chordal accompaniment in the left. The final chorus begins with Armstrong holding a high B-flat for almost 4 bars before breaking the tension with his improvisation. The solo breaks off after 8 bars, which leads into the coda. Appropriately enough, there's a final trumpet flourish, giving Armstrong the last word on this recording. I want to return to the beginning because it is the most famous and striking part of West End blues, Louis Armstrong's opening fanfare cadenza. Now it is one of the most widely imitated of all jazz solos, but it would have been startling and thrilling to audiences of the time in its boldness and rhythmic freedom. The virtuosity of the playing and the fact that it was just Armstrong alone put the spotlight squarely on him and signaled in the most definitive way that the collective music making of earlier New Orleans jazz was on its way out. Many later commentators have argued that this is the point when jazz, which started as entertainment for dancing and drinking, this was the point when jazz became art, when it could, in the word of Schiller, quote, compete with the highest order of musical expression, end quote. Armstrong would go on to have a long and distinguished career. He would top the UK charts as late as 1968 with his vocal performance of What a Wonderful World, but West End Blues remains one of his crowning achievements. I hope this video has helped you with your ATAR studies, and good luck with your exams.